You can only imagine the stacks and stacks of PowerPoint presentations by planners and strategy folks in our company trying to figure out what it looks like, what the world looks like in 2025, let alone 2050. It takes a tremendous amount of planning and forecasting by companies like ours. And a lot of our ability to peg our emissions reductions in those out years is based on our assumption, we think it's a good assumption, about certain things. And one of those things is the availability of even lower cost renewables and even lower cost battery storage. Affordability is hugely important, not just for our company, but for our state regulator, who is concerned about our customers and the rates they pay. So we are banking on technology continuing at its current pace and even accelerating those areas. And so from that perspective, as a utility, isn't necessarily allowed to do R&D. Of course, our state regulator wouldn't want our customers paying for us to do R&D projects. We need that R&D to take place somewhere in this economy, and we think that there's an important role for the federal government to play in accelerating the technological development on things like renewables, but especially on storage. I think I'll leave the other ideas we may have for later or for my colleagues on the panel.
Well, thanks, Andy, for that. Yeah, that's exactly the point here. Is really how can we mix and match, the desires of the business community to make progress, and at the same time, what policies are going to help in the near term help accelerate and incentivize that work. So next, I'm going to turn to you, Geir, and Equinor. You all started as an oil company called Statoil, but you've really made some dramatic changes to the ways you run your business, making a transition to becoming more of an energy company as opposed to just an oil company. I know that doesn't sound right, because just an oil company is a pretty big deal, but you're really looking at how that diversification goes and what the future holds. So, where do you see the biggest opportunities, and what needs to happen as you look at those opportunities at the federal level to help, again, accelerate or seize the day?
Thank you, Bob. We clearly see that we are in a transition to a low-carbon future. This clearly poses some challenges for a company with our background. But at the same time, as you say, we also see opportunities in this transition. And we like to talk about opportunities as creating or sustaining a low-carbon advantage. And there are basically three aspects to that that I wanted to highlight very briefly. First, we are further reducing the emissions from our oil and gas production. Our license to operate, as we see it, depends on continuing to reduce emissions. We see the future for somebody producing oil and gas as being increasingly price competitive and carbon competitive, meaning that low-cost, low-carbon producers will be the ones that prevail longer term. Consequently, we are focusing not just on what we produce, but how we produce it. And there is a role for policy here in setting a framework that can help us realize emission reduction targets. We can get into some of that, perhaps, in the discussion. Second aspect of the low-carbon advantage, if you will, is our focus on investment in renewables. We have committed to invest up to 20% of CapEx over the next 12 years in what we call new energy solutions, so low-carbon technologies. Here in the US currently, that means investing in offshore wind. We have leases off the coasts of Massachusetts and New York currently, and we are looking to expand our footprint in offshore wind in the US. Development of offshore wind, of course, can enhance US energy security, and it can help states meet their renewable energy targets. But it requires that the policy environment at the federal level provides developers like us with long-term certainty and stability to scale investments over time and not just do one-off projects. We are encouraged by what the administration is doing to seek to expand offshore wind development in the US. But we would also like to see a leasing process for offshore wind that provides regular access to new acreage in order to expand long-term investments. And we believe that if the US is to develop its own offshore wind supply industry, which is only in its infancy today, developers need that kind of long-term perspective in order to continue to invest. The third aspect of what we are focused on is carbon capture and sequestration, carbon capture, storage, and utilization. We believe that CCUS must be part of a technology-inclusive approach to dealing with climate change. We have done quite a lot in the CCUS space on the Norwegian continental shelf, but going forward, we see opportunities in developing new business models around CCUS, moving from pre-combustion capture and storage from our own operations to developing CO2 transport and storage utilizing third-party emissions. We are currently involved in two such projects, one in Norway, one in the UK, where we will source CO2 from industrial emitters, try to create hub and cluster model for storing CO2 in the North Sea, deep under the seabed of the North Sea. All this, however, does require a policy framework that supports the business case for CCUS investment. Here in the US, the expansion and extension of the 45Q credit is a good first step to incentivize CCUS deployment. And it could put operators on a path towards the kind of cost reductions that we still need to see in order for CCUS clearly to take off, which it needs to do over the next decade or so in order to have a meaningful impact by 2050. So those are three examples of where we see carbon advantage, or where we seek to create carbon advantage. Some of it around doing more in the hydrocarbon space, but continuously reducing our footprint and using CCUS, and then also investing in renewables and other forms of low carbon technology.
Thank you, Geir. Those are great observations, and I think obviously in line with what we're talking about today in terms of near-term bipartisan support on action. Steve, next I'm going to turn to you. Steve, Intel is obviously a technology company, a storied technology company that's been around since we started to figure out how to do smaller and smaller computers. And in fact, I think we all learned how things keep getting smaller from you guys. But one of the things we often think about with efficiency is, well, let's get different kinds of light bulbs, let's turn the heat down, or these other things. But really, there's a whole area of intelligence that can be behind how efficiency works, and we're learning more and more about this, obviously, every day, and how that can help us in all kinds of things in our lives. But tell us a little bit about what you guys are doing on that intelligent side of efficiency, and what measures you think can help move that along more quickly or provide a more, as Geir was saying, stable environment for them.
Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks to C2BS for this opportunity. I'm happy to hear you refer to us as a storied technology company. I have a son who works for a startup autonomous vehicle company, and last night he referred to Intel as a tech dinosaur, which occasions some conversation over the phone. But I think most analysts would agree, and McKinsey has some fairly old, but I think still a fairly valid analysis of the marginal cost of doing various things to attack the climate problem. And they're ranked by cost effectiveness. And there are things that are below the zero line, which actually means they save money or they can make money for someone. And those are almost all in-use energy efficiency plays. And if you look at them individually, 90% of them have a technology component. And one of the things that's been gratifying for me in the 18 years, 20 years I've been working for Intel is I used to talk about the role of technology as part of the solution, not just part of the problem. And people would look at me like I was a unicorn or had a cyclops eye on my forehead. And now I think increasingly, helped by this report significantly, policymakers and the public are starting to understand that the word smart buildings, smart homes, smart cities, is shorthand for the role of ICT in driving efficiency. And we like to talk in actually two terms. Everyone knows about the footprint: carbon footprint, energy footprint, water footprint. That's your direct impact, whether you're an individual or a company. But the folks at Ceres taught me another metaphor, which is the handprint. And we think our industry, the ICT industry writ large, is the only industry that has a handprint. And a handprint is how your technologies help others reduce their footprints. And we're trying to apply this concept both in our direct operations. We used to be known, and in some circles are still known primarily as a PC company. We make all kinds of kit and sell into all kinds of markets. And I think one of the great things about the report is if you read through it, and I recommend that you do, I'm not sure it's worth memorizing, but it's certainly worth reading. There are a number of recommendations that have a technology component. I think that's positive. But it has a negative aspect to it from an advocacy standpoint. Because ICT is a cross-cutting enabling technology, and it's not one thing, it's not a stovepipe kind of solution. I think sometimes people overlook the role of ICT. But I commend, for example, in the report, the discussion of modernizing and improving the resilience of infrastructure. That has to start with ICT technology. Renewables. We power 100% of our U.S. operations, 70% of our global operations through the renewable market, both directly and through the direct market. Key to making that happen is the ability to integrate the renewables onto the grid, and that's all done with ICT. And so that's really a very critical thing. We've also moved to 100% LEED certification for all of our new buildings and all of our new factories. And a lot of that is accomplished through the application of smart technologies that use our technology or other people's technology at its base. And we're starting to work in other industries, particularly in the grid, to sell solutions that allow the grid to operate both more resiliently and more efficiently, so more of the electrons that are generated actually end up on the other side of the meter. I used to be in the oil industry many years ago, and I'll cite two examples. The first application of technology I ever witnessed to address oil issues was at Amoco Oil, where I was involved in the refining operations. We wanted to improve the efficiency of our refineries, and we did it by outfitting the plants, the refineries, with a tremendous number of sensors and some fairly sophisticated, but by today's standard, primitive computing technology. and dramatically improve the efficiency. We did that for cost reasons, but it had an environmental benefit as well. And I'll just cite one other application in the oil and gas industry. If natural gas is going to have a longer rather than a shorter role as a bridge fuel or however you want to term it, it's going to have to involve the reduction in methane emissions. And the application of modern technologies, sensors, drones, in monitoring where the methane is coming from and therefore where it should be controlled can be absolutely critical. So overall, I would say read the report. There's a lot of good stuff. A lot of it is technology and what we call intelligent efficiency oriented. But the main theme is we're not going to get to 80% by 2050, or probably what we now need to do is better than 80%. We're not going to do that without innovation. And so, we've got to put in place policies that promote innovation, and there are a number of recommendations in the report to that end.
Thanks, Steve. All good points. Ashley, I'm going to turn to you next. I like the way when I read your title that the word land was in it. And Mars is a company that relies on agriculture. And, we've been talking about the power industry and technology here, but we also have this whole arena of agriculture and land use. And so could you talk a little bit about how Mars is thinking in that arena, and how should that inform us on near-term ideas from your perspective? Thanks, Ashley.
Thanks, Bob. Thanks so much for inviting us to come to the table, and thanks for the great work in the report and with all the important recommendations for how we can take action now on this important topic. So let me tell you why Mars is here. So Mars, first of all, is a global food, confectionery, and pet care company. You may not know Mars, but you definitely know our brands: M&M's, Snickers, Pedigree, Uncle Ben's Rice. And Mars is here talking about this issue and taking action on this issue because the science of climate change is clear. And if anyone questions that now after the IPCC 1.5 report, then you clearly have not read between the lines. That was so obvious that we need to act now, and we need to take this issue seriously, and that this issue is not about politics, but it's about both an environmental imperative and, for the companies here in the room and companies around the world, a business imperative. Mars launched our Sustainable in a Generation plan in 2017 with this in mind. We knew that in order to be a successful company over the long term, we have to take this issue seriously and take responsibility for our footprint, both carbon, water, land, etc., our impact on the environment and on people throughout our supply chain. And in that sustainability plan, we set a science-based target to cut our emissions by 67% by 2050. Not just our operational emissions, and not just the emissions that are caused by the electricity we use in our factories around the world, but our full value chain emissions. So the emissions caused all the way from when an ingredient is grown in a field, all the way through where it comes to our facilities, to when it is sold to a consumer and actually eaten. And that's really critical because the impact that we have as companies on climate change goes beyond just our walls, and we need to get really serious about that. The main way that plays out for Mars, as Bob mentioned, is through land. We've had a lot of discussion so far about the energy sector, which is obviously critically important, and we've seen a lot of great trends in the US and globally toward clean energy. But did you know that actually agriculture and land use change account for about a quarter of global emissions? So right on par with the energy sector. And for Mars, if we look at our value chain, it's even more stark. About 75% of our carbon footprint is from agriculture and land use change, things like deforestation that can be caused from growing crops. There's also been a discussion about carbon capture and storage. Do you know the most efficient and easy way to store carbon? in the trees and in the soil. So, we really have to start thinking about what can we do in the land sector, both to understand the emissions coming from the land sector, but also how it can be a really significant part of the solution. There was a recent report that came out from the Nature Conservancy on natural climate solutions, and they did some work with some other organizations, and they estimate that something like 37% of the emission reductions that we need to stay under 2 degrees can come from the natural climate solutions, essentially from storing carbon in trees and in the soil. And the ways to do that are also fairly simple. Techniques that have been already happening around the world: conservation agriculture, sustainable forestry, things like managing how you put your nutrients on cropland, managing grazing practices, things like cover crops and no-till. So all of these things we know how to do, and we just really need to scale them up. So the way Mars has been treating this issue is we set a goal for our full value chain. We are now looking at each of our key supply chains in determining where are the biggest sources of emissions and how can we work with our suppliers and farmers to address those emissions. So let me just give you an example that has some relevance in the U.S. I mentioned that Mars, one of our brands, is Uncle Ben's rice. And we use a lot of rice from the U.S. In Uncle Ben's rice. And we've been working with farmers to work on their irrigation practices to reduce the methane emitted from rice fields. Methane from rice fields is actually a pretty significant source of methane. When farmers use alternate wetting and drying methods, we found that they can actually both reduce their water use and reduce carbon emissions. And in some cases can actually see also gains in yield, or at least not see losses in yield. So that's really critical. So, I think these recommendations about what we need to do in order to really transition our economy to a low-carbon economy or to a no-carbon economy, I really can't emphasize enough how important the land and agricultural solutions are in those recommendations. So if you think about the Farm Bill and what ways we can incentivize farmers to take on these practices and what ways we can show them, they provide the food to the U.S. and to the world, what ways can we show them that we value those outcomes? That can be through the NRCS program, that can be through various crop insurance, ways to sort of deal with crop insurance, and there's just a myriad of ways that we can help farmers have the incentives, access to finance, et cetera, that they need to undertake these changes and essentially store carbon in the soil. Just 2 more quick statistics that kind of got me. So there's been several studies recently that show that sustainable agricultural techniques, often on balance, don't cost tremendously amount more than traditional practices, and in fact can lead to higher yields of crops. So over the long term can actually be more profitable. And yet, only 50% of U.S. agricultural land is currently under no-till, and that's only part of the time. And less than 10% of U.S. agricultural land utilizes cover crops. And so that really begs the question, why? What incentives do we need to change? What policies and programs do we need to change to transform the U.S. ag industry and really be part of the solution on climate change? And so Mars is here because we want to help with that transformation.
Thank you, Ashley. All very good observations, and I hope the folks in the audience can see the diversity of kinds of businesses and all the different components of how the puzzle has to be put together. Hicks, I'm going to turn to you next. Lafarge Holcim, again, a major player in building materials, cement. Decarbonizing industry as a broad category is pretty difficult. It's such a diverse sector. Different kinds of manufacturing processes, different products. Are there particular areas that where you see some innovation or federal policy or efforts that could help the work that you guys are doing as you're moving through your own goals and actions?
Certainly so, Bob, and I want to share with you, like my colleagues before me, my appreciation for having us here, for setting up this forum, and your staff work has gone into your near and long-term recommendations. For those of you who've not had a chance to read those materials, I hope you do. And I hope you take a couple of highlights from them home and maybe work them into the policies that you're working on within your organizations or offices here on Capitol Hill. So I think it's worth prefacing a little bit about my company. As Bob mentioned, we're a cement manufacturer. So cement being the powder that holds concrete together. Concrete is the second most consumed commodity around the globe, only behind water. So we're talking about a very widely used product that goes into everything from building buildings to hospitals, schools, roads, bridges, airports, etc. So as Bob mentioned, our reach is far and wide, and certainly in the past it's been a large CO2 footprint that we bring to the table. But I'm proud to say that I'm part of an organization that is moving forward, and we're part of this innovation conversation. We have commitments to reduce our CO2 footprint by 40% by 2030. So we're working as a company to decarbonize our manufacturing processes and products. So I'm very proud to share that with you today, and there's certainly a common theme, or thread I should say, that works its way into our policy development and business development. I want to share a couple of things with you guys today that I think you'll find relevant. It's sort of an overarching theme that I bring to the table through my industry and company when we're talking about climate change policy. Some of the things not to forget. So manufacturers here in the U.S. Appreciate their competitiveness globally, and we want to maintain that. So for a group like mine, who is an energy-intensive, trade-exposed organization, along with steel manufacturers, glass manufacturers, and others, it's important when we're talking about policies to beware and be conscious of those imposed on manufacturers, making sure that we remain competitive, remain a global leader in the products we provide and the folks we employ and the intellectual capital we share around the globe. We talk about leakage, so when we have the opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint here in the U.S., we want to make sure that the products that we manufacture are also those that are not undercut by other companies, organizations, and other countries that are not exposed to some of the carbon capture practices or policy restrictions that we are here in the U.S. So that's important to a company like mine that has a global product that can be shipped all around the globe. Another thing I'd like to bring up with you guys today is process. And so when we talk about cement manufacturing, we literally melt rock. So we're talking about a process that is very energy intensive. It's a chemical process that takes place at temperatures above 1,500 degrees. We're certainly weaning ourselves off of the fossil fuels that drive this. But in the reality, you're talking about many millions of dollars in changing over both manufacturing equipment, people, processes, etc. So when we talk about fuel switching and energy efficiency, there has to be a complementary regulatory framework along with that. So as much as I want to do something, I have to be able to get the permits to do it. And that's federal, down to state and local level. So that's, again, an important theme that runs for my company and organization through this conversation about developing policy. And we're talking here about federal support. We look at incentive programs around the world that are really driving a lot of change in countries, and certainly countries where my company operates. And we're jealous because they're doing some of these innovative practices that we're going to get to here in the U.S. And we need those incentives because, typically speaking, it's the large upfront costs that keep us from moving forward and making those changes that we want to make. Again, it goes back to the theme of remaining competitive globally. And so I appreciate C2S's approach on market-based solutions. I get it, mandates may be the quickest change, but we also want to keep our competitiveness. We want to have the best manufacturing here in the U.S. Compared to our partners and trade partners around the globe. And I think you guys think about that a lot, and certainly appreciate that. But again, happy to be here. I'm very proud to be a part of a company that is decarbonizing both our processes and products, and look forward to continuing to be part of this conversation. So thanks, Bob.
All right, Hicks, thank you so much. Yes, quite challenging, and getting incentives and moving some barriers are all things that we're looking at, trying to be able to move forward in the near term. Conrad, I'm going to turn to you now at Entergy, another power company in the central southern part of the country in Louisiana and Arkansas, I think, a little bit.
Arkansas, Mississippi, and Southeast Texas.
And a company that, going back almost a decade, had started looking at its entire profile of pollutants, not just carbon dioxide, but all of them, and its role in dealing with those reductions. And so you've been on that ambitious track for quite a while. What have you seen as some of the levers that help you get that work done, or that you'd like to see made more available going forward? Thanks.
Thanks, Bob. Actually, Entergy made a commitment. It was the first electric utility in the country to make a voluntary commitment to reduce carbon emissions, and we did that in 2000. The commitment was for 20% below year 2000 levels, and we've met that every year. In fact, right now we're at about 26% below year 2000 levels. And the electric utility industry as a whole is about 28%, I think, Andy, below 2005 levels. So it's a good news story there. And I think, Bob, to answer your question, part of the reason that that's been able to happen is the low price of natural gas. I think the lower cost of solar and wind. And unfortunately, nuclear power, building that has proved to be a little bit economically difficult for some companies. But obviously nuclear is a big part of the solution as well. But for us, a lot of it was our generation fleet to begin with. And we only have about 8% of our generation is coal. And that's going to change over the next decade. It will be about 3% by 2029. And we're about 45% natural gas and about 40% nuclear. So it's a pretty significant portion of our fleet that's lower emitting, and our natural gas is continuing to be replaced by cleaner natural gas, combined cycle plants that emit fewer tons of carbon dioxide than the older natural gas plants. So technology development has been a huge part of it. I think the things that can help us get further, R&D was mentioned before, bring down the cost of carbon capture, bring down the cost of battery storage, electrify the transportation fleet, as was mentioned before. Transportation is now emits more carbon than the electricity sector. So it's important that an economy-wide approach be taken, and we think that certainty is an important issue for an industry that spends over $100 billion a year on capital improvements or expenditures, building big things, expensive things that take years to plan, maybe years to even get permitted sometimes. But the challenge that we have right now is everything gets regulated, goes to court, spent years, there are appeals, goes to the Supreme Court, gets kicked back, gets rolled back by the EPA, and then they go back to courts again. If you get some certainty, you can plan for the future, know what the rules of the road are, and with innovation, technology, research and development, we can get there. Economy-wide approach, hopefully, is the most efficient way to get there. Thanks, Bob.
Well, thanks, Conrad. You know, I think all of you, first of all, you guys are all here as leaders. There's no doubt your companies are taking charge, but I want folks to know that, you know, you're representative of what's going on out there. We often hear about all the confusion about how and when we are going to make progress, but yet we have substantial parts of the American economy trying to figure out how to make progress, and what you've all outlined here are a number of measures that could help get that progress going a little faster, or make it a little more certain, or get us a foundation for the next step, you know, whether it's, for instance, battery research. So I think you've really covered the landscape. Before I turn it over to the audience for questions, I'm going to ask each of you sort of to quickly give an example of something where popping out of your sector, where a relationship with another group of what an easy one might be. Well, I'm not going to give you an easy one. We're going to make you come up with that. But an idea of where you and another sector working together could actually make even more progress, or that it would be a unique way to create some innovation. And Andy, we'll just go down the road again here on this side.
Yeah, I might be taking the easy one that you were going to mention. I mean, the really apparent one to us is certainly with the transportation sector and electric vehicles. I mean, it is a matter of necessity that we're going to have to be working together so that we effectively deploy the charging infrastructure that's going to be necessary to support growing consumer demand for and pull forward consumer demand for electric and autonomous vehicles. And there's also the important question of how that all gets paid for, right? These are really big policy questions that a lot of the electric companies are dealing with at the state level with their regulators. But I see that as the most obvious and pressing, and to my mind, exciting opportunities to partner with someone other than just another electric utility. Sorry, Conrad, if I stole the obvious one.
Geir?
Yeah. So if you're in the business of providing energy, of course you have a lot of interfaces with all panelists here. But I would mention one area in particular, and that is the work we're doing in CCUS, trying to capture and store emissions from industrial facilities. The projects we have under development right now, for example, in Norway, involves taking CO2 emissions from a cement plant, taking CO2 emissions from an energy waste plant, and in the UK, taking emissions from power plants. So those are three interfaces that I can think of right off the bat.
I'm going to mention two very briefly, just because I wanted to key off of something Ashley mentioned earlier. The first thing I would focus on is our own supply chain. Intel is very unusual, relatively unusual in the tech industry, and we make our own stuff. And we make our own stuff mostly here in the U.S. Most of the tech brands that you know of that sell to the consumer, they design their own stuff, they market their own stuff, and they turn to somebody in Taiwan or somewhere else to make it. We make our own stuff, so we have a much larger footprint, and we tend to get rated lower sometimes than some of our tech colleagues because they don't make things that we do. You can't make semiconductors without fluorinated chemicals and without fluorinated gases. And the biggest way we've reduced our emissions dramatically, like 80% over the last 20 years, is by finding substitutes that are lower GWP fluorinated gases for higher GWP fluorinated gases. We have plucked all of the low-hanging fruit in that particular realm. Now what we're realizing is in our factories, we use what we call tools, which are $50 million or $100 million machines that do the photolithography in a hermetically sealed environment. Those machines use a ton of energy, and they use more and more over time, just the way the technology is going. So one of the things we're now starting to focus on is working with our tool suppliers, the applied materials, just to cite one example, of the world, to find ways to work with other companies like Texas Instruments and Micron that also make semiconductors, to work with the suppliers to dramatically improve through the procurement requirements the efficiency of those machines. And then finally, since we're in the middle of the supply chain on our customer side, precision agriculture is a big, big growing market for us. The use of sensors, artificial intelligence, IoT, and big data, the cloud, all these tech buzzwords, to help farmers be much more efficient in their operations, which means they use less gasoline or diesel, they use less water, they use less chemicals. It's not just a climate benefit, it's an economic benefit, and it's a water quality benefit, etc. So that's another area where we're increasingly focused.
Stephen, you took mine. But it's true. I mean, you can imagine.
This is good, though. This is good.
You can imagine for a food company how broad and complex a supply chain is, right? Like we source over 140 ingredients from over 80 countries around the world. Not to mention so many that we source just within the U.S. and how many states and how many producers. At one estimate, we figure that we have between 500,000 and 1 million farmers throughout our supply chain. So you can just imagine how much data that really is, especially if you're going to start to try to influence those emissions and reduce your footprint. So we really rely on measurement tools and database systems from the ITC sector to help us estimate, measure, and verify all of that information to show that we're actually making a dent, to show that we're actually making a difference. And then I'll give one example of a partnership that's more within sector, but if you kind of separate a little bit food manufacturing from the agricultural sector, we don't own any of these farms. We don't run any of these farms. We're, in many cases, 5 or 6 companies set apart from the actual people growing the food, right? So that cooperation is critical, and that means working with the commodity buyers and traders that are really right next to the farmers, because they're the ones together that are sort of determining how things are grown, what the inputs are, what they require, et cetera. And then also with the ag extension services, so also partnering with government officials, because they're the ones that are sort of recommending how these things should be done and providing some of the capacity building tools and resources. So there's really partnerships at all levels that you need in order to make this happen.
So Bob, I'm going to pivot to an innovative product, if you don't mind. So we are working with the transportation community on pavement vehicle interaction. So what MIT has found is if you get harder pavements, your tires actually have better interaction, therefore being more efficient when they rotate, so you don't lose traction. It's a tremendous savings in terms of gasoline usage, which is a direct, obviously, emitter. And the second part of this story is a pretty cool one. So we're talking about transportation and the ripe opportunities to electrify and decarbonize that space. So we actually make pavements that have charging running through them. So you actually get charged as you drive over the pavement. So it's a continuous charge. And no, this is not hypothetical. It exists. Unfortunately, it's not in our country, but we're part of that in countries around the globe. So there are plenty of opportunities out there with the right focus to do some really cool things to decarbonize the transportation space, thanks to concrete.
Sounds like a concrete idea. I know, we'll stop. Don't make me do it.
Actually, that you mentioned the charging concrete. About 10 or 15 years ago, I worked with some folks at Oak Ridge Lab on some of those things. So it's interesting how we go back to R&D, basic science R&D, and now things are becoming a reality. So, and what's great is when we do that in America, American companies do that, they get the intellectual property to export to the rest of the country. And I think that's a huge thing. We would rather do things in America for 2 reasons. One, it benefits America. 2, it's probably done cleaner and more efficiently here as well. This is a global issue. A ton of carbon is a ton of carbon, whether it's emitted in Beijing or Birmingham. We'd rather have it emitted in Birmingham because it's going to be less carbon per unit of output, probably. And that's a really good news story for the U.S. at this point in time. I'll just mention one thing from a partnership standpoint. This is more future-looking than anything else, but Entergy has just embarked on installing new advanced meters. So spinning meters with people have to come out and read, we're all used to, those are going away. These will communicate directly back with the company. And there'll be so much data being able to be gathered. Customers are going to have better ability to track what their energy usage is, and their meters will be able to interact with smart and efficient devices in their home. So in the future, speaking of partners, our whole community is going to be because we'll be able to text a customer automatically and say, we think your air conditioner is broken because it's running, but it's not cool. And the meter will know that because the air conditioner will be communicating with the meter. Would you like us to call a contractor? We have a list of pre-approved contractors or air conditioning repair shops. That's just one example of a potential usage for some of these technologies that are coming out today. That, right now we've got smart Nest meters at home. You can control temperature thermostat from your phone. You can unlock your door from your phone. The future is wide open, I think, and electric utilities, which are typically slow to evolve, have an opportunity really to be a service provider for their customers more than just providing power or lights.